As we start this lecture on intimate partner violence, formerly called domestic violence, I want to just point out this is an important yet common issue. Many of you may have had experience with this either personally or with your loved ones. You may have had an experience being the victim or a perpetrator or a combination of that. It's pretty easy for relationships to get out of hand, to get heated. And so if this is stirring things up for you, I just encourage you to seek your people and support and let me know if I can provide additional resources. As we're going to learn, Michael Johnson's Typology of Violence, first published in 1995, drastically changed the field of intimate partner violence. His research is really focused on heterosexual couples, but his typology has been translated to LGBTQ couples as well. And his typology helps us understand why, if you just survey a room of 100 people about who have experienced violence, been the recipient or been the perpetrator, you'll find more gender symmetry between men and women. Yet we know that, like for shelter populations, it's predominantly women. So how do we understand this discrepancy? Messinger provides an important perspective because so much of the intimate partner violence literature is really focused on straight couples, and it's important to understand that IPV occurs in LGBTQ couples as well, sometimes even at higher rates. And so this has implications for policies and programs which have been based on the idea of a female victim and a male perpetrator. So this question just asks about your experience or that of maybe someone you're close to having experienced intimate partner violence, because again, it's pretty common. Okay, in this lecture on intimate partner violence, or IPV, we're going to be talking about Johnson's typology, demographic trends, Colorado law, the types or categories of IPV, treatment, and theoretical perspectives. Okay, let's get started with Johnson's typology. So again, Michael Johnson developed this typology in 1995, and it became more widely known in the early 2000s. It was a landmark kind of distinction in our field for both researchers and therapists and how they conceptualize intimate partner violence. So the two main categories, the first one is CCV, or coercive controlling violence. When we think of like the DV that we see in movies, kind of more stereotypical, that's what CCV is, where one person is kind of dominating, isolating, and micromanaging the other. This applies more to criminal samples where people had a domestic violence charge, and shelter populations. So this is control motivated, and it's affecting maybe all aspects or multiple aspects of the victim's life. They're feeling, maybe they're feeling physically intimidated, they're feeling psychologically, that they're experiencing psychological abuse, or maybe financial control, or, other areas of their lives. So it's more far reaching. It's more likely to be one person, more of the perpetrator, and so it's not and unidirectional. It's more frequent violence, more severe forms of violence, and it's more likely, especially with heterosexual couples, to have more kind of violence post-separation, more stalking, more harassment, and women who are trying to co-parent, for example, with a formerly abusive partner, will report higher rates of conflict and harassment. Coercive controlling violence used to be called intimate terrorism, so you might see that mentioned. The second category is situational couple violence. This used to be called common couple violence, but people got upset about the use of the word common. This is, instead of being control motivated, this is conflict motivated and situation specific. So this is basically, I'm not out to control you, but our argument got out of hand. I lost my temper. I threw something at you. I blocked your path. I shoved you. I crushed your phone. I threatened you, or something like that. And so this is more what we see when if we were to survey our whole class, and have people kind of check off, have they done any of these behaviors or had these behaviors done to them? This is more what we're getting kind of for a lot of couples, is just more situation specific. And we'll talk about what this looks like for therapy too. So this is then more partner symmetry with both people kind of exhibiting IPV, and it can go back and forth. It tends to be less frequent and less severe, and there's less risk at separation to have the intimate partner violence increase. So just a little bit more on these differences between situational couple violence and coercive controlling violence. So again, situational couple violence, someone's not out to control the other. They're more just to win the argument, right, or make my point. So much smaller range of kind of control tactics. The motivation, again, is like, I'm going to win the argument, not I'm out to kind of tie you to me so that you'll never leave me, isolate you. The impact from any physical aggression isn't as far reaching. It's not like it's affecting your work performance as much, or your social life, or your mental health, as much. And then the partner's subjective experience is that they're not typically scared of their partner. They're more just embarrassed that this is happening and wanting to change it. All right, let's talk about some demographic trends related to intimate partner violence. So again, if we just survey large groups of men and women, we might see a similar lifetime prevalence of experiencing or being a victim of intimate partner violence. So 29% of men, about 37% of women, yet that goes up to women, 44% for women of color. So we can see some more similarities in the quantity over our lifetimes, but we will see that the violence that men and women tend to experience on average is qualitatively different. Certainly there can be men who are subject to very severe violence, but on average we see that women have higher rates of sexual violence, severe physical violence, multiple forms of violence, more likely to be injured, much more likely to be killed by their partners than men are. So for example, in physical violence, women are more likely to report that they've perpetrated pushing, slapping, kicking, punching, hitting with objects, or throwing something at their partner. But in terms of what they receive, they're more likely to be the recipient of more severe forms like choking, slamming against the wall, arm twisting, sexual aggression, and coercive control. Women who are perpetrators of intimate partner violence tend to have shorter criminal records and are less likely to reoffend, so lower recidivism. Okay, so let's talk about some of the risk factors for male perpetrators of physical violence, and there's just been so much more research done on this than for female perpetrators. And these factors do tend to apply globally, not just within the United States. I think it's important to be aware of these factors because if you're working with a family and seeing a few of these red flags, it's just a reminder to be assessing for intimate partner violence if you haven't already. And we're going to be talking more about how to assess. And so substance use is the most common co-occurring issue with intimate partner violence. So that one's an important one to know. Also, male depression or conduct disorder, impulsivity, which is sometimes associated with ADHD, antisocial behaviors, lower income, higher economic stress, lower academic achievement, acute stress, especially for men who are under chronic stress and then, for example, lose their job or their partner has an affair, having less social support or social capital, having grown up with a model of male dominance or seen that in your culture, having witnessed or experienced abuse as a child. This is a stronger correlation for perpetrating coercive couple violence, coercive controlling violence, than it is for situational couple violence. And then as having higher emotional reactivity or an insecure couple relationship, which is again kind of going to exacerbate that demand withdrawal pattern that could get out of control. Okay, so test yourself on this. Which of the following is the strongest correlate with a male perpetrating physical violence on a partner? And it's A, substance abuse. Okay, so we are just beginning to pay more attention to male victims and survivors of intimate partner violence. And we know that in terms of the rates of male victimization, the CDC estimates that nearly a third of men will experience sexual violence, physical violence, or stalking in a romantic relationship in their lifetime. So this is excluding childhood maltreatment. About half these men are going to experience it young, so before the age of 25, and report both male and female perpetrators, with higher rates of female perpetrators. McLeod and colleagues, in terms of men's experience and reporting, did a systematic review of studies over a 10 plus year period from like 2012 to 2022, came up with 16 studies and kind of have summarized the qualitative themes of men's experiences. So men are much less likely to report intimate partner violence for a number of reasons. It may be that they're not aware, that they don't even think of themselves as victim because of the way we socialize gender roles in our society. It's not until later or on a self-report we're like, yeah, I guess I did experience that. They're afraid that if they report, they'll still somehow be labeled as the perpetrator, or they won't be believed. They're afraid of embarrassment, shame, ridicule. They might be afraid, just like many women are, of losing their children or having a negative impact on their family, their workplace, their community. And we have, of course, less or little to no, oftentimes, male-oriented services, whether that's cisgender, straight, or gay. And, oftentimes the police aren't trained on that as well either. Okay, so there's emerging research on LGBTQ couples, which suggests that there are higher rates of intimate partner violence, and that's including psychological aggression, which is the most common form for everyone, straight or gay. These higher rates are hypothesized to be due to minority stress theory, the ongoing pressure of discrimination, internalized homophobia, concealment, perhaps higher rates of trauma. And research has demonstrated the presence of many of the same dynamics of abuse across straight couples and gay couples: psychological abuse, jealousy, power, and control. More research has been done on lesbians, and there's evidence that it can be coercive, controlling violence. But again, there's more evidence for situational couple violence, and that it's more likely in gay couples to be bidirectional as compared to straight couples, where it might be unidirectional with the male perpetrating on the female. We do see that bisexual and trans individuals report higher rates of physical and sexual abuse, and LGBTQ, Black, and Latinx also report higher rates of intimate partner violence in general. So Messinger has some recommendations for how to approach LGBTQ IPV and changes that need to be made. So first is we just need to attend to it more in our research and policy. We need to be less focused on heterosexual and cisgender individuals. That agencies who are supporting IPV need to take same-gender IPV seriously, especially since it might be more common than different gender, and it can be as severe. IPV agencies need to be able to support same-gender IPV and all genders, such as having different wings in a shelter, for example. Perpetrator programs need to be adapted for women and other gender identities, as well as challenges specific to LGBTQ couples, such as homophobia, transphobia, and threatening to out someone as a means to control. So in terms of relationship status and rates of intimate partner violence, even though we definitely do pay attention to dating violence and it's a concern, overall, dating couples are most likely to have the lowest rates of violence. However, it's important to know that dating violence is correlated with teen pregnancy. So if you're running a dating violence prevention program, you want to be kind of also including teen pregnancy prevention. Or if you're working with teen pregnancy, you want to be assessing for intimate partner violence. Cohabiting couples have the highest rates of violence, and we're not totally clear why, but this is likely a selection bias because IPV increases the risk of separation for both married and cohabiting couples. Then it's just basically at its lowest in married couples, because basically cohabiting couples who are experiencing IPV are more likely to self-select out of marriage, they won't go on and their cohabitation will just end in separation. Or married couples who are experiencing IPV are more likely to divorce. And then divorce and separation, you may have heard this before, but it's a higher risk time if it is coercive controlling violence, not if it's situational couple violence, but if it's coercive and control, then this is a higher risk time for more severe and fatal violence following kind of the initial separation or right after the breakup. One research study by Halpern and Meekin found that in emerging adults, verbal abuse and physical violence was more prevalent in what they call churning relationships, where people weren't really together or they weren't broken up, as compared to couples who were stably together or stably broken up. So it's just this idea that instability or this kind of limbo, this churning is associated with increased conflict that can put you at risk for IPV. Okay, laws for intimate partner violence or domestic violence vary by state. So I'll just be focusing on Colorado law, but you can be checking out the laws in whatever state that you're in. So domestic violence in Colorado, and I think across most states, as far as I know, is only in intimate relationships. So it can't be violence between roommates or between, for example, adult family members. And in Colorado, it's defined as either the act of violence or threatening it. And it's not just harming or threatening a person. It can also include their property, an animal, things like that as a means to control. You may have heard this, that when a police officer in Colorado has probable cause to believe that a crime of domestic violence has been committed, and they're called to the scene, they're required by Colorado law to arrest at least one person or both people involved. But if they arrive at the scene and there's not probable cause, then they don't have to arrest someone. But it was originally put in place so that they wouldn't show up at the scene and then kind of, the perpetrator is telling the victim, don't say anything, and that they would leave without arresting someone. So it was designed to kind of serve as protection. So in Colorado, domestic violence isn't a crime by itself. It's an enhancement to another criminal offense, such as harassment, assault, trespassing, destruction of property. So upon conviction of the original or the other criminal offense, then there is a domestic violence enhancer added, which carries additional sentencing. So in addition to whatever you were going to have to do for the assault, now you have mandatory perpetrator treatment, which is often like 36 weeks of domestic violence treatment that the perpetrator has to pay for themselves. The underlying charge can include many different types of crimes. So it could be murder, negligent homicide, kidnapping, sexual assault, rape, robbery, assault, battery, property destruction, harassment, or stalking. And so any of those is already a crime, and then you could add a domestic violence enhancer to that. So you can test yourself on this, but the answer is no. In Colorado, you can't just be charged with domestic violence. It has to be another crime, like assault. That could be in an intimate relationship, but might not be in an intimate relationship. Okay, so let's get into the different types or categories of intimate partner violence. Here's the ones I'm going to cover. Physical, the one we think of most stereotypically. Psychological, the one that's most common. Sexual, economic or financial, using systems to control, and stalking. So as we go through these slides, some of these items are going to be crimes depending upon your state, and some of them are going to be behaviors associated with intimate partner violence, but not technically a crime. A lot of the things on the physical violence slide are crimes, so the intent or threat to harm can, in various forms, can be a crime. So obviously anything where we're really harming someone is often a form of assault. But even blocking someone or restraining them can be unlawful restraint. Even pointing a gun at someone, even if you're not using it, can be a crime of, depending on the context, crime of menacing or disorderly conduct. So yeah, you can see on this slide there's examples of either actually hurting someone or kind of threatening to hurt them or intimidating them by, breaking their cell phone, punching the wall next to them, throwing something at the wall next to them, forcing them to use substances, those kinds of things. Okay, so psychological aggression, like I mentioned, is the most common form, and yet it's the hardest one to pin down for victims because it's so nebulous. This is basically just trying to make somebody feel bad about themselves, and we've all done some of this, maybe when we're at our worst, and so this is, of course, just on a continuum. I think it happens a lot of times because either maybe we don't feel good about ourselves, or we're afraid of abandonment, and so we try to make somebody else feel less than, so that either we can feel better about ourselves or they won't leave us. But these can be things like, cruel or demeaning comments, degrading, interrogating someone, where were you, why are you dressed like that, kind of badgering them. Of course, it can be threats, threats to harm, threats to harm family, children, pets. Those are generally can be considered crimes. Threats to out the victim or disclose other private information about them, criticizing them, and then more extreme jealousy. So normative jealousy is like, yeah, if my partner goes out with his friends, maybe I feel left out. But extreme jealousy is I don't let my partner go out, or if they do, I give them the silent treatment, or I engage in self-harm, or I get really drunk, or something like that. A red flag, of course, is feeling like you can't ever win an argument, or that somebody else is just always placing the blame on you and never taking responsibility. And so I think this is important for us to remember, that even if we have the verbal or cognitive skills to win arguments and make it all about someone else, it's not really healthy to do that. And so, yeah, this making a partner feel crazy is a hallmark of psychological abuse. Can also be humiliating them in public, accusing them, for example, of like having an affair or flirting with somebody, or those kinds of things. Okay, sexual violence or aggression, obviously harder to talk about. And you can read through some of these examples, but it can be forcing people to participate in sexual acts that they don't want to be a part of, or that are more humiliating or demeaning. You may have learned, that it's only in the 1970s, 80s, and early 90s did states pass marital rape laws. So prior to that, if you were having non-consensual sex in your marriage, it wasn't considered rape. Even after we passed those laws in the criminal justice system, marital rape is often treated differently than rape outside of a marriage. Even kind of making demeaning marks about a person's body, their history, their sexual behavior, or participating in and flaunting affairs with others would all be examples here. Okay, so a lot of things on this list wouldn't be a crime unless it's something like fraud, but these are actions that we might take to control someone to make it harder for them to leave us, so that they don't have access to money or access to employment, that maybe we're doing things to jeopardize their employment, taking money from them, or, for example, deliberately sabotaging their credit rating or their finances. So stalking, obviously, if you've had this done to you, it can be really scary. But I also find it interesting because, on the other hand, I think I might have a little bit of a stalker in me. I think if someone were to break up with me, I could do some of this, driving by their house, driving by their workplace, begging them, calling them incessantly and begging them not to leave me. And so I think some of this is reading through it and being aware that we have to check our impulses, especially if we have a more anxious attachment style, to not, do something that makes us look like stalkers. I did support a friend one time getting a restraining order who had dated someone, broken up with him, and then he kept leaving her gifts outside her front door. Magazines, flowers, different things, and she asked him to stop and he didn't. And it just started to feel scary, that he's kind of showing, I was here, right? You can't stop me. And so I did accompany her to court to get a restraining order, which she was successful getting, and it became permanent. Okay, so you might think about how you would answer this in terms of your own experience, either in intimate relationships or friendships. Have you either kind of done some stalking behaviors or been the recipient of stalking behaviors, or a little bit of both. This last slide is just about using legal systems to try to gain control, threatening to have your partner arrested for illegal drug use, threatening to have them be committed or institutionalized, threatening to call Child Protective Services and accuse them of child maltreatment, threatening to report their citizenship status or to file for divorce and fight for full custody of the kids, for example. Okay, we've just got a couple of slides on treatment. Obviously, if you pursue a career in counseling, you'll get lots more training on the treatment of intimate partner violence. Okay, so let's talk about some of the common research-based or evidence-based IPV interventions. So the most common ones are for domestic violence offenders. They're often called batterer intervention programs, or BIP. They often follow the Duluth Power and Control framework or model, and that's that wheel that you see there that you've maybe seen before. This is based on kind of cognitive behavioral therapy. It's more psychoeducational, anger management. These are often men-only educational groups, and obviously we're needing to increase that for other genders. Researchers are investigating how to modify Duluth to be more effective, because as we're going to see, it's not, by including, for example, trauma or adverse childhood experiences, ACEs, and a restorative justice model, if you're familiar with that. We do have an RJ model here in Fort Collins for adolescents, for example. But most studies, regardless of the intervention strategy for domestic violence offenders, don't report much success, that approximately 1 in 3 will have a new episode of intimate partner violence within 6 months. So basically, if you're arrested and not treated, you have a 35% chance of remaining nonviolent. And if you're treated, you only gain 5%. It only goes up to a 40% chance of remaining nonviolent. We have better success with our victim treatment programs, which are often kind of the shelter advocacy approach. That's a lot of psychoeducation around what intimate partner violence looks like, about PTSD, using a CBT or cognitive behavioral therapy approach, sometimes with motivational interviewing. And again, we see a large effect, indicating that even though people might have to leave a couple of times or more than once anyway, the shelter advocacy approach does decrease the likelihood that they're going to return to their partner or re-experience violence. And this research is usually on women. In terms of couples treatment with Sandy Stith and her colleagues, this is for less severe violence, so more likely to be situational couple violence than coercive controlling violence. And it's an 18-week manualized program. It's based on solution-focused brief therapy. It also includes a lot of psychoeducation. And it's delivered by co-therapists in either a group format or just a single couple format, separating for at least some of the time the perpetrators and the victims for at least a lot of the initial sessions. And it has shown, at least for situational couple violence, to have significant reductions. So couples therapists have to decide whether or not a couple is appropriate for couples therapy if there has been violence in the past. And for a lot of couples coming to therapy, there has been violence. And so in the initial sessions, couples therapists are assessing, asking, especially in the individual assessments, if there has been violence currently or in the past, if either person has any safety concerns or is fearful. And then getting a sense of the severity. And the common questions are, what was the first incident, the worst incident, and the most recent incident? And you can also be giving them questionnaires. But therapists are basically trying to determine if this is more coercive controlling violence, couple violence, or is this more situational couple violence? Ongoing coercive couple violence is not acceptable or appropriate for couples therapy, because there's just not enough safety, and you can actually make someone more safe, or less safe by doing therapy with them. They could then get punished, when they go home for what they said. I was in a situation really early on as a beginning therapist over in the CSU CFCT, where I was seeing a couple who had just had a baby, but they were being required to attend therapy because while she was pregnant, the husband had had an affair. She threatened to leave him, and he pulled a gun and pointed it at her. That was as far as it went, but he was arrested for that. And they were really hoping to come in as a couple. I loved them. They were a great couple, actually, great together. And I think this was a really anxiously attached guy who kind of panicked and didn't behave, obviously well. Obviously, that was a really bad decision to pull a gun. He didn't want to have to do a batterer prevention program or an anger management class. And he asked me to make the case that he didn't have to do that. But obviously, in consulting with my supervisor, we just decided pulling a gun is too severe. That's a severe form of intimate partner violence. And so I had to tell him no, that we couldn't see them as a couple, and he had to go to an anger management program. And he wasn't happy with me. Many years later, I ran into him in King Soopers. He had the kids in the cart, and he was like, "Hey, do you remember me?" And he initiated the conversation. I was like, "Yes." He said, "I just want to tell you that anger management was really good for me, and that was just what I needed, and we are doing great. We're doing just fine." So it was a good learning experience for me. Okay, so test yourself here. Parker and Quinn report that there has been violence in their relationship in the past, but not currently, and they indicate in their individual sessions with their couples therapist that they're embarrassed about the violence, and yet they don't fear for their safety. Can the therapist proceed with couple treatment? The answer there is yes. Okay, another one to test yourself on. Jesse and Alex report violence in the past, and in their individual meetings with their couples therapist, Alex actually reports more violence than Jesse and expresses fears of Jesse. Can the therapist proceed with couples treatment? In this case, the answer would be no. This seems to be more like coercive couple violence. And a hallmark, it's not only the fear, but when there's a discrepancy, oftentimes in the violence that is being reported, where the victim is telling you more and the perpetrator is minimizing it, that's also a red flag. Okay, let's finish talking about theoretical perspectives. So since we focus more on theory in this class, I thought we should just bring a little bit of a theoretical lens to this. So social learning theory is often cited in the IPV literature. We don't study that in this class. You've probably learned about it elsewhere. This is where we just learn by watching others, right? And things can be modeled and reinforced, in our family of origins or our earlier relationships. So for example, experiencing or witnessing experiencing child maltreatment or witnessing intimate partner violence growing up is a strong predictor of experiencing that in adulthood, either as a victim or a perpetrator. The life course perspective, which we've talked about in this class, a couple of relevant ideas would be trajectories. This idea that, again, kind of related to what we've experienced earlier in life. Adolescents who are, for example, victimized in dating relationships are more likely to be victimized again in young adulthood. They're on a different path. The concept of linked lives, right? And this is this idea that we have a shared history and our patterns can repeat themselves, that the previous generation continues to influence the current generation. The feminist perspective or gender theory would say, of course, with our gendered roles, perhaps, from a more heteronormative perspective, we're socializing males to be more at the risk of being perpetrators, women more likely to be victims. And then in terms of the meaning versus observable behavior, this came up a little bit in Michael Johnson's work, that the meaning of, for example, slapping someone across the face is different depending upon the gender of the perpetrator. Women do suffer greater injury, fear, and psychological outcomes from being slapped than men do from being slapped. And boy, if you watch old movies, women are slapping men across the face all the time. And I don't think that's a great idea, but we obviously think of that differently than if a man slaps a woman across the face. With social exchange theory, we could pull on that. Researchers studying IPV have used that comparison level for alternatives idea that female victims of IPV are likely to be thinking about kind of what are my alternatives, and if they have more financial resources or educational resources, then they are more likely to leave because they're comparing themselves to women who can support themselves versus women who, for example, are in poverty and not supporting themselves. Attachment theory would say that it actually predicts both victimization and perpetration. So attachment insecurity makes either of those more likely. For example, with violent men, they often, as I've mentioned, report more anxiety over abandonment. They're more hypervigilant to their partner, higher rates of jealousy. So yes, kind of this more anxious attachment style. Okay, so some faculty in my department have used developmental systems theory. I'm not as familiar with it, but as I understand it, it's basically trying to include the dynamic processes over time on our development between genetic, behavioral, environmental factors. So understanding that it's complex and not a real simple kind of cause and effect relationship. So this slide is focusing more on the environmental and generational patterns related to intimate partner violence. And so people who are perhaps more at risk for later intimate partner violence grow up in a family context that has more risk, such as more economic disadvantage and stress, or disengaged or harsh parenting. This then leads to adolescents who aren't doing as well, more likely to be getting into trouble, lower mental health. This also means that they're more likely to associate with other peers who are struggling too. And then because they're more likely to choose a partner from their peer group and someone who's similar to them, which is about assortative mating, which is kind of about homogamy. So if we're choosing someone similar, then we end up with two people who have kind of risky backgrounds. And so then they have a higher couple risk context with more aggression, less kind of relationship skills that then kind of leads to intimate partner violence. Okay, so you may have heard me talk about differential susceptibility in another class, but it's one of our gene-environment interaction theories. And it basically says that based on our genetics, some of us are more susceptible or reactive or responsive to our environments than others. And those who are more reactive or sensitive are called the orchids. And orchids, of course, flourish if their conditions are great, just like orchids do, but they do really poorly if their conditions are not great, just like orchids do. Dandelions, on the other hand, are kind of just in the middle, kind of more average, not great, not terrible, and they don't change so much whether their conditions are awesome or more poor. And so when we translate this into research on, for example, violence, there are some genes that are associated with more kind of aggressive behavior. And so when you think about that, you can have, you get two versions of each gene, two alleles for each gene, one from your biological mother, one from your biological father. And you could be homozygous for one form, or homozygous for the other form, or heterozygous, have one of each. Differential susceptibility researchers often call the less common one the short allele. It's the plasticity or sensitivity allele. And so if you have two of those, then you're the orchid. If you have two of the long allele, which is the more common allele, then you are the dandelion. And if you're heterozygous, then you are somewhere in the middle. And research finds that emerging adults who have two plasticity alleles for the GABRA2 gene, who are the orchids, they are more aggressive to their partners in emerging adulthood if they were harshly parented, but they're the least aggressive if they had supportive parents. And we're going to see a graph on that on the next slide. Okay, so this is just a graph from this research study. And so there's the scale on the left-hand side, the vertical axis, which is like how much hostility are they showing with a romantic partner. And then there's a scale on the bottom, which is how much harsh parenting did they have. And this was a longitudinal study tracking, basically videoing people in interaction with their parents in adolescence, and then videoing them later with their romantic partners. And then people coded, how much basically hostility was in each video, essentially. And so what you can see there is that the dandelions could have had really supportive parent, very low, almost no harsh parenting, or really high harsh parenting. And their line wasn't really that different. It was kind of mid-range for their hostility with a romantic partner. Whereas the orchids, if they had the least amount of harsh parenting, then they had the least amount of hostility with their partner. And if they had the most amount of harsh parenting, then they had the most amount of hostility with a romantic partner. So again, this just helps us understand a little bit why some people can grow up in an abusive, for example, or violent home and not continue to perpetuate that in adulthood, whereas others can grow up in that situation and are more at risk for perpetuating it. Okay, so you can test yourself on this. And the answer here would be A, an orchid who had experienced harsh parenting. All right, this was a tough lecture. I hope you're doing okay and you made it to the end. Let me know if you need some support.